Hi, this is Monica Larner, the Italian reviewer with the Wine Advocate, with another appointment on our Instagram Live. Today we're going to speak with Axel Heinz, who's the general manager of Ornellaia and Masseto. And here, I think I have him here, there. I will invite him in, add. And of course, Ornellaia and Masseto are two separate estates. But in the grand scheme of things, they represent perhaps the single Bordeaux-inspired winery that I cover in Italy. And it's interesting because right now we are in the middle of the Primeur season in Bordeaux, and my colleague Lisa is reviewing many of the great chateaus. And I am overwhelmed by this, this vision of wealth and the commerce and the sophistication of the wine marketing machine behind, of course, Bordeaux. And then we move over to Italy, to a winery like Ornellaia and Masseto in an area along the coast of Tuscany called Bolgheri, which is very rural, very empty, open spaces. And up until just, about just 10 or 20 years ago, I think, do I get Axel here? Let me try again. Try to connect again. I saw him trying to connect. Let's try again. Let's do this again. Sorry. So I was saying up until about, just not that many decades ago, the coast of Tuscany was very rural. It had, cherry and peach orchards. It was completely dominated by horse farms and very rural. Here we go, Axel. Hi.
There we go.
Good morning. Good morning for
Hi.
you and me, and good afternoon for you.
Yeah, good afternoon, late afternoon.
Good late afternoon. Hi, you look well. Yeah. How have you been doing all these months in lockdown? How's it been for you?
Strange. First of all, strange, because obviously a vineyard does not know any lockdown. So while the whole area was really quite scaringly empty because everybody stayed at home, apart from obviously the ones who had to look out for vineyards and any other sort of crops. So we kept on working as usual, because we had our bottling and racking schedules in the winery. And, when the wines start budding, then you have to go in the vineyards. But I just heard you mentioning what an empty place, how much empty space there was in Bolgheri. I can tell you, it was even emptier than what you've ever seen. It was quite scary, driving down. Not that we have any sort of massive traffic jams going to work, but still going to work for 1.5 months without seeing any car on the road was really something quite striking.
Well, that brings me to what I was saying, because I wanted to tap into that. I'm fascinated by the fact that we have this magnificent wine identity that's so important to the heart and soul of Italian wine. And in an area that doesn't have the flashiness, it doesn't have this huge, this context. And I'm just wondering if you could set us up a little bit about the beginning of Ornellaia and Masseto, specifically about the soils, the territory. What drew people to this site? Because it was completely unknown. There had been no wine history there. There had been no previous experience. So it was kind of a huge risk in a sense. And what were the winning factors that brought to the existence of these twin estates or double estates?
Well, it's difficult to speak about any wine in Bolgheri without mentioning the ancestor of all of them, which is Sassicaia. And for sure, that was the only sort of guarantee. I know that when the founder and owner of Ornellaia, Lodovico Antinori, decided that he wanted to make a project on his own, he first of all went to California, planning to do something there, probably as far away from his home context, just to make something entirely new. And much to his surprise, he was told to go back to Tuscany because there was so much going on there and so many new exciting wines being made. And quite luckily, I think for Ornellaia, there was at least one example of already quite established greatness with Sassicaia. I mean, the first vintage of Ornellaia was 85, and that was probably the most legendary vintage of Sassicaia. So that was the first. I think Sassicaia showed everybody else, if it's possible to make such a profound wine in this area, this cannot be just by chance. There's got to be something worthwhile trying out in this coastal part of Tuscany, which indeed had not been regarded as particularly interesting. Quite funnily, if you look at the history of the DOC, when it was first established in the 1980s, it excluded the red wines because people thought, you know, it's not good land for Sangiovese, so why try? I mean,
why bother?
Where you can't grow Sangiovese, it's useless to try with the reds. But since it was close to the beach, people tried with white and rosé. So those were the first Bulgari wines. And quite funnily, there was no DOC for the reds up until the mid-1990s.
Of course, yeah.
But still, there was this example of Sassicaia that has certainly indicated to us from Ornellaia and the other handful of pioneers who tried to make wine there towards the shift, you know, between the 1970s and 1980s, that there had to be something to be tried out there. And,
you know, it was. I mean, it's once Michele Sata, who's also a winemaker in Bulgari, said that we are all children of Sassicaia. I've always loved that quote because it is, you know, especially to your area. And of course, you know, Bulgari is also very influenced by a small collection of noble families that have been guardians of this land. And so the choices, you know, between them have, you know, there's been a lot of communication between them and choice and whatnot. But still, I mean, it was, you know, specifically where the Masseto vineyard is. I mean, you know, it's up at the base of a hill, you know, and it's kind of hidden, tucked back in there. I mean, it kind of represents a specific thinking and a choice that's actually quite remarkable from the very beginning by Ludovico.
Even if I have to say that a lot of what has come out as being great wines of Bulgari have really been discovered almost by chance. Because if you think of Sassicaia, it wasn't a sort of blueprint project. I'm going to make a great wine there. It was no. I love Bordeaux. I love Cabernet Sauvignon. And since it's difficult after the Second World War to get any in Italy, I'm going to plant a Cabernet Sauvignon vineyard. And it was discovered that that Bordeaux was probably a great place for Cabernet Sauvignon. And a bit of that happened with Ornellaia and specifically Masseto as well, because the idea around Ornellaia was obviously, let's try to make another wine in this area, but let's make sure that it's not going to be seen as a mere copy of Sassicaia. So we have to find slightly different angle. And at some point, the idea of Merlot came up, which we're thinking about the early 1980s was not an obvious choice because, you know, back then, let's say at an international level, if you wanted to be noticed, you would plant Cabernet Sauvignon, Chardonnay. Merlot was not yet that super hyped and popular grape variety. And it wasn't necessarily met with great enthusiasm. And I believe it was very much the brainchild of Andrei Cherichev, the famous consultant from California, who insisted on Merlot, saying, make something slightly different, make a blend that has Cabernet Sauvignon, but also Merlot, and let's try to find a place where Merlot could work. And then he spotted out this hill, which is almost, you know, very, very, very hidden. And so, oh, there's gray clay there in the soil. That sounds familiar, sounds interesting. So let's just try. But again, there was no plan. And as it turned out, after the very first harvest in 1986, the wine was so spectacular that quite quickly, although it wasn't initially planned, it was decided to make not only Ornellaia, the wine, but also something else, because this single vineyard site seemed to have all requirements to make a wine that would stand up on its own. But it all came around without any other ambition or plan to say, let's try to replicate the greatness of the only known wine from Bulgaria at the time, Sassicaia, in a slightly different interpretation. And the magic was that it worked, and it worked in different places. Other people have tried something else. Colleagues on the other side of the road from Le Macchiole have been successful in introducing Syrah and making something very interesting out of it. So it's true that nothing of that was planned, but luckily we were able, and it's quite a remarkable story, I think, in good old Europe, to really unveil a great terroir which went completely unnoticed for centuries.
You know, and Bulgari is always fascinating me just because, you know, the enormous variation in the soils. I mean, you get everything there. There are alluvial plains, there's parts of slate and black, you know, granite almost. You have blue clay, you have magnesium rich soil. So it's almost every little parcel that kind of sits along the winemaking region can claim its own specific you know, soil type and yeah, I think quite complicated. So so I wanted to get a little bit, I wanted to talk, of course, I just recently reviewed two wines, of course, the Ornellaia and Masseto, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of separating the two wines and how what was the thinking, because before they were kind of, you know, the estate was seen as one, but over the years now we've accepted to regard them as two separate entities, and I wanted to know why you decided that was important and how that went about. So basically, you know, I have the two wines here.
Exactly.
Masseto.
I recognize them. They're
You
familiar.
recognize them.
Well,
it is
you know,
you.
as I just mentioned, I mean, the fact that those two wines emerged was something that took us a little bit by surprise because it wasn't planned, but it just turned out to be a fact. Tasting the wines and seeing there was something really, really special going on. So it was clear to us we had to make both of these wines. Ornellaia because it was the one that was originally planned, and Masseto because there happened just to be a micro terroir that was so strong and with such a strong identity that it just had to be produced on its own. And for almost 20 years, both wines went along a little bit the same path, but at a certain stage, we probably felt a little bit frustrated, because if a wine is just part of a range, it is a label, it is a wine, and it's difficult, I think, for people to understand that they are separate wines related to each other because they're made by the same people and because the estate originally was the same, but they're really two different wines. And we also were starting to be a little bit frustrated to see a sort of internal competition emerge between these two wines. And we've never, although we quite early on realized the very specific character of Masseto, which deserves for us to be treated separately and as an individual, we never necessarily thought, and still do not continue to think, that both wines, that one wine is quintessentially superior to the other. They express two different, I would say, facets, again, of a growing area. Masseto being one very specific terroir that makes a specific expression, and one could even argue whether it is a typical expression of Bulgari, because it's all Merlot, because it's all blue clay, and so there's something very specific and unique to Masseto. And on the other hand, Ornellaia, which is a very true, I think, expression of what Bulgari is, also because we have, as you well know, vineyards in different areas of the appellation, and Ornellaia is a blend out of the best parts of the entire estate. And to us, it's just as great a wine than Masseto, but just different. Maybe also a little bit more consensual, because obviously when you're blending a wine, you have the possibility to play a little bit more with the raw materials you have, and to sort of also a little bit in the tasting room create a consistent style. Whereas Masseto is something different. Masseto is a wine that I know for sure some wine drinkers love to hate, because it's a wine of very strong character, and there are people who are absolutely mad about it, and others who don't get it, who prefer Ornellaia. But that's just fine, because they're just two different wines. And so to us, it was clear that at a certain stage, we had to give a clear message about the individual and separate identities of these two wines. And I think there's no other way around that than to, you know, divide them into two different estates. The vineyard of Masseto was always very clearly individuated and separate from Ornellaia. And now that it's not only got an estate, a vineyard on its own, it's also got its own facility, the cellar where everything is being made. It is also physically quite apparent and quite clear that the two wines are separate.
And that brings me actually, excuse me?
Hate to see, I mean, even if I still continue, and I'm very jealous about keeping the privilege to be able to oversee both, obviously.
Listen, I see that we have some questions, and we will get to them as we go forward. There's actually already a question about Massettino, but before we get to Massettino, because I wanted to follow in this arc. So you mentioned the new winery. To further, you know, create two separate identities, Masseto now has its new winery that was just inaugurated about a year ago, almost exactly a year ago at this point. So can you tell us a little bit? I mean, it was one of the best kept secrets in Italian wine, because for years, or about 2 years, I guess, prior, I saw, when I would come to visit you, the construction site, and I was not allowed anywhere near. And then I noticed a huge crane, so I knew that something beautiful was being, you know, being constructed. So can you tell us a little bit about this exciting adventure of creating this beautiful new winery in the heart of the Masseto vineyard?
Well, first of all, it's a thing of, you know, in a career, usually it's a thing of your lifetime. Building, well, it's very often you obviously have the occasion to do slightly partial new buildings in a winery, upgrade some facilities, but it's not that common that you have the task and the mission to build an entirely new winery. And it was great because we were quite clearly led by what we knew already about Masseto, having vinified it for about 30 years. We knew exactly what we needed and what we wanted to have to make this winery. And quite funny, there were also some requirements that we had from a bureaucratical side in terms of preserving the landscape. So we had to build up underground because the site where Masseto is situated is a protected landscape site. So obviously it had to have as least impact as possible. But then on the other hand, you know, building a wine cellar underground is not something that strikes anybody as being totally logical. So we knew that we could incorporate gravity flow. We knew that we could keep it small and simple and really specifically designed to the needs of Masseto. And then also focus on some things we had already tried out at Ornellaia, like the use of concrete tanks. We made the choice to vinify Masseto all in concrete because we've acquired a little bit of experience with that material and we tend to like it quite a lot. And then obviously, you know, gravity flow, all these things, but also we tried to do, to build a cellar, which you've seen, which would also speak of this wine. So the fact that we dug it right into the clay, which is at the heart of, you know, that terroir of Masseto, and kind of suggesting with the building that we literally carved out the cellar of the rock of the clay. And we also left some little spaces where you could see that amazing, you know, several feet deep bank of clay on which really Masseto is situated. Was something where we felt, you know, it's not only just the wine, it's also speaking about the identity of this wine. And it's at the same time a bit rough because the materials are very simple and there's a lot of concrete and a little bit of just, you know, concrete, a little bit of metal and glass, and then the barrels, which are the only sort of completely let's say organic part of this winery, but at the same time it combines this sense of roughness and refinement, which I find can be found in Masseto as well.
But it has a very elegant aesthetic. You know, it was designed by a Japanese architect, and it's really, you know, in my mind, it's kind of that winery represents the end of the flashy wineries. You know, I mean, it marks the end of an era, because before there was a lot of monument to wine, and this is more kind of an introspective workplace, you know, a practical winery. And again, it has a very simple lines, very elegant, incredibly elegant, but, you know, and hardly visible from outside. There's a farmhouse right right next to the new winery, the old, original farmhouse. And that, I guess you've converted that into a tasting room. So when you drive up, pretty much that's the only thing you see, because the winery is almost hidden completely. It's beautiful.
Well, which is the reason why we kept it as secret for as long as possible, because we knew the fact that you don't see anything from outside. Once you get into the winery, there would be an element of surprise. Had we revealed a little bit beforehand, before the opening, we would have removed that potential impact. So that was very important for us, because although we were the first to discover this place, when we worked on the project, we quite clearly saw that there was this idea of really making it a journey into Masseto and keeping an element of surprise, which we didn't want to miss.
Before I saw the new winery, I tasted with you, and I remember you hinting that there could be a second wine once the new winery was open. And at the time, I almost thought, no, that couldn't be, because how could there be a second wine to Masseto? Because Masseto kind of, has this halo around it, and it didn't seem to make sense. But I mean, obviously, with the fact that you have, a dedicated winery, it does make sense. And so last year, in addition to the Masseto, you introduced the Massettino. Here we have the two bottles here. Right. And the difference is that the Massettino is a more playful wine, and it doesn't have that kind of that opulent flashiness of the Masseto. But Massettino really stands on its own. I loved tasting it, because it has more electricity, more energy. It has a kind of a nerve to it that makes it very, very playful and fun. And there is a small percentage of Cabernet Franc in the blend. So it's not 100% Merlot. And I just noticed that one of the questions that one of our viewers asked is, how do you make the selection of fruit between the Masseto and the Massettino?
Well, we do that. There's several aspects to that. Now, obviously, the final decision is always made during the blending, because we don't like, in all of our winemaking philosophies, we don't like to decide too much beforehand what is going to be, let's say, Grand Vin second wine, a little bit to Bordeaux parallel, because I think that is a limitation. If you start to decide that a particular vineyard site is, let's say, second range, then the risk is that you're going to sort of intuitively treat it as such, and maybe you're going to, not allow it to express whatever it can express. Now, it's clear that in the history of Masseto, there are also some changes. I mean, we have started to remove some of the earlier plantings, and we've replanted them. So there are obviously some younger vines. There have been sections of the Masseto that historically have always been an optional addition to the blend, because sometimes, deciding upon a blend is not just saying, I'm going to put all the good wines together and the lesser wines on the other side. Sometimes it's just a question of synergy, and a very good wine could be excluded just because it does not completely fit into the blend. So that was also a decision. So there are all these other aspects. There's the fact that some 10 years ago, we started to decide, yes, we know that obviously Merlot works at Masseto, but maybe there are other options. And we started planting Cabernet Franc. And quite honestly, not necessarily just to say we're going to plant Cabernet Franc for a hypothetical second wine. We're going to obviously use it in the second wine, as long as we are not convinced that it could be a worthy addition to Masseto. But, God knows, maybe in a few years' time, you'll be surprised when you get your samples with the tasting sheet. Maybe you'll find a drop of Cabernet Franc in the first wine as well. So we're not excluding that.
I wondered about that. In fact, it definitely, it begs the question, honestly, because the Cabernet Franc adds this, this other dimension, and Cabernet Franc has been showing such beautiful results in Bulgari. Generally speaking, is really, there's a lot of energy behind that grape in your area. So I mean, I wonder. That was the first question I wanted. The next question I wanted to ask you: might we see some Cabernet Franc in Masseto?
Very honestly, I don't know when, but I hope that's going to happen, because as you were saying, I mean, Masseto is something different than most of Bulgari because of its soil. But indeed, we know that Bulgari is one of the places in the world, probably, and I, having had the privilege to work in one of the other places in Saint-Emilion, where you can have some truly fine and great expressions of Cabernet Franc. I think that is possible in Bulgaria as well. It should be possible at Masseto. Now, obviously, it's quite a responsibility. So we need to be convinced that it is giving something, even an extra dimension to Masseto without, let's say, betraying its genuine character. So that is why, you know, we're not, you know, rushing things, and whenever it's going to be the time, and it may be never, I don't know, maybe we'll decide that, you know, no, let's keep it the good old way, because otherwise it's going to turn Masseto in a different wine. But from the bottom of my heart, I'm quite convinced as soon as the vineyards are going to be old enough, I'm quite sure that this is going to be a great addition potentially for Masseto as well. Is that going to happen in 2 years' time, next year? Well, next year we have already harvested, so we kind of know. I don't know, but well, we'll let you know anyway.
I don't know, but let's just say, from the journalist in me can confirm that you do not exclude the addition of possible.
No. We do not.
Possible Cabernet Franc. Listen, Axel, let's talk a little bit about the latest vintage, because you are now on the market with the 2017. And the 17 comes out after an exceptional 2016 and an equally beautiful 2015. Two vintages that I love. Perhaps, you know, now with having tasted even more wines from the two vintages, you know, there is a distinct personality, obviously, that defines the two, and they are kind of, you know, I mean, in a sense, they're even growing further apart, because the 16 is taking on greater linearity, and the 15 is just becoming even more, you know, exuberant and expressive and loud and beautiful.
Right.
And then you get the 17, which was, you know, definitely a more challenging vintage, because it was warm, it was hot and dry, and the fruit sizes was smaller, and, you know, you had to make choices in the winery. I know that in terms of Masseto, I think you told me that the 17 was your earliest harvest ever in the history of the property. So can you walk us through a little bit about the current vintage, the 17, and some of the challenges you faced, and how you dealt with them, and maybe even give us a throwback to 15 and 16 and why those went well?
Well, you know, sometimes when you have those truly great vintages, you tend to fall short of an explanation, because there are sometimes, I like to think that they're a gift of nature, because sometimes really what makes the truly great vintage is something that is even sometimes hard to explain. And even in the case of 15 and 16, if you look at them, they seem, you know, at first look, remarkably similar in their growing seasons, and it's really about the details that could seem almost unimportant, that you can distinguish why 16 indeed is the purer, the more linear, the firmer vintage, and 15 is the more luscious and exuberant wine. But it's just about, you know, some tiny details, the hotter temperatures in July and much of August in 2015, the fact that it rained mid-August in 2015, and on the other hand, 16 stayed dry up until mid-September, but then the temperatures were cooler. So these are elements that explain why these two wines have different profiles. When it comes to 17, the thing I'd like to think is that any kind of vintage would have had a hard time following these two, 15 and 16, because I think they're really modern day benchmarks for the area, which we will remember for a very long time, because, you know, it's not that frequent that you get two side by side, almost perfect vintages, and then also with different expressions, which I think makes them even more interesting, and everyone is free to choose his own personal favorite. I'm not saying that I have my personal preference, but I would agree with anybody who thinks that, you know, the other one is his preferred vintage, because they're two generally great vintages. It's true that 17 had some major challenges, so it was, but I've never felt, and I can say this today probably because I think I stated it very early on in July, when everybody in Italy was saying, oh my God, this is going to be a disaster. And I said, no, let's wait. First of all, dry vintages have always been quite remarkable in Bulgaria. And you could name vintages like 97, 98, even 2006, they were extraordinarily dry vintages. And to some extent also hot vintages, and they've been remarkably successful in Bulgaria, because Bulgaria is a bit different, because it's coastal. You have always the cooling element coming in. There are these deep alluvial soils which can cope with quite long drought phases. So I was never feeling that we were already defeated before we had harvested, because now obviously with all the idea around climate change, as soon as we got a hot and warm vintage and a dry vintage, we get nervous, we get anxious. But that's sometimes forgetting that probably 30 years ago, everybody who would have said it's an early vintage, it's dry, and it's been hot, people would have said, wow, this has got to be a great vintage potentially. Today, where we are anxious to preserve also as much as we can finesse and freshness, because sometimes we have the feeling that the natural conditions we're experiencing every year are, you know, enhancing structure, concentration, ripeness. So obviously we don't want too much of that. And as soon as we get a vintage that potentially drives us into this direction, we immediately start to figure out how are we going to make balanced and fresh wines, because, you know, we know how to make concentrated and rich wines, but, you know, we only want as much of that as is reasonable. For sure, when it comes to such dry conditions and early harvest, everything becomes very critical, because you know that every choice you make can be potentially completely right or completely wrong, and there's really not much in between that. And we quite early on realized that we would have to pick early. But I also must say that why we started very early on, and for everything that was Merlot, including Masseto, it was a very quick and very early harvest. So Masseto, and that is quite unique in its history. The only comparable vintage would have been 2011, was picked in only 3 days between the 25th of August and the 30th of August.
How about 2003?
Yeah, but for the Merlot, probably. But I don't think we picked Masseto quite as quickly as we did in 2017. On the other hand, you know, even at Ornellaia, by the 4th of September, we were through with Merlot harvest. But then we stopped because we realized, you know, still the Cabernets are in good shape. They haven't suffered too much from heat, and they deserve a little bit more hang time. So we refrained from saying, you know, now that we got started, let's just get on with it and finish by the 15th of September. Right. But because we know that it's always the dilemma in such early vintages, you know, that you will have to pick early, because you don't want to lose the freshness. You don't want to get into the overripeness. That is always quite unappealing. But at the same time, you know, that if you, that particularly the ripening of the tannins will not be something easy to obtain. So it's always a little bit of trade-off between how much freshness do I keep and how much do I allow the tannins to get sufficiently ripe. And in the case of many of the best Cabernet vineyards, we saw that had we picked them too early in September, maybe we would have had the freshness, but definitely would have went into something a little bit lean, a little bit herbaceous even, because, you know, that's what you usually get when you're forced to pick too early in such vintages. And so that was one of the secrets. And the other was realizing it was an easy thing to do, because really the berries was so small that we knew we had to slow everything down in order to make balanced wines, because the concentration would be there anyway. So we really went for shorter macerations, as little pumping overs as possible, in order to just get the most refined, the finest tannins, and not do anything that would be too overpowering, because that was definitely one of the risks in 2017. And well, I don't know if we succeeded in that, but I personally like the 17s. Is it fair to compare them to the perfect 15s or 16s? I don't know, but I think we're able to at the same time express the very ripe and generous and you know, sun-drenched character of the 2017s, without making wines that would be unbalanced or heavy. And I think they have beautiful texture. They maybe don't quite have the purity of fruit that the 2016s have, but you know, that's within the genes of this vintage. It's one that is a little bit more generous, a little bit more opulent, but there's no heaviness in these wines, which I find quite remarkable. And certainly the single grape variety we're most worried about was Merlot.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Masseto fared very well in this vintage. And also when I look at the blend of Ornellaia, there have been some very hot vintages like 2009 or 2003, where we really dropped out much of the Merlot to a point where Cabernet Franc had a higher proportion in the blend than Merlot. And that didn't happen in 2017 because the blend of Ornellaia is actually a quite classical, typical blend with 25% of Merlot, which honestly, by the end of harvest, I wouldn't have guessed. I would have guessed maybe we'll have to sacrifice some of that Merlot. But at the end of the day, the great vineyard sites fared really well.
We have another question, which I guess was bound to happen, Axel. Why are the wines so expensive? Somebody asked.
I think because, you know, it's because I suppose because people want them and because they're sought after, and because as with every great wine in the world, you know, that there are release prices who tend to be what they are, and then when the wines are being sold according to their demand, the prices rise. So I mean, we've been say not candid observers of what was going on with our wines, particularly obviously with Masseto. But we realized that there were in demand, that the prices on the market were high, and we sort of adjusted to that. I think they're a reflection of the demand, and that's all. I mean, I realize that you know, even for myself, if I think of what a bottle of Masseto cost when I joined the estate in 2005 and what it costs now, I can understand that, yeah, it's what it is. But, you know, it's just a sign that people want those wines, and therefore they're becoming expensive.
Well, I see a lot of comments about the price, but I have to say, from a personal point of view, you know, there is value in having expensive Italian wines, because obviously the image and the entire identity of Italian wine also has a huge component that is fine wines, collector wines, wines that appeal to, you know, collector's audience abroad. And so I think it's important that the price pyramid of Italian wines reflects, you know, a healthy and vibrant wine economy for the country. I wanted to jump back just a little bit to climate change, and we were talking about the 2017 and Masseto, and I'm just wondering, what are some of the other, what do you foresee some of the other changes to be as we go forward? Because obviously 17 is one hot vintage, and perhaps we'll be fortunate we won't have many more of that, but we can maybe count on the fact that this will happen again. And I'm just wondering, what steps are you taking to kind of prepare yourself for besides the addition of Cabernet Franc?
It's one of the elements, though.
Are there other things that you're looking at specifically for your site with that in mind?
Yes, well, there are several things, and there are several ideas, and that mainly because if we take a closer look at climate change, we realize that it's a little bit more complicated than saying we're just having a higher frequency of hot years like 2017, which have existed in the past as well. They were maybe a little bit less frequent, but still they have existed in the past as well. We've seen trends that are not very easy to describe, because if I take a vintage like 2017, people would say, well, this is probably the most you know, typical expression of what is bound to happen with climate change. Yet, one of the most significant years, quite oddly, in terms of climate change, would be 2014, because that was worldwide one of the hottest years ever. And through the whole year, if you take the average temperature even at the estate and in Bolivia in 2014, it is one of the warmest years. Yet, it was warm in all months apart from August and September. So the profile of the wine is completely surprising because the wines are actually more cool climate style, although all across the year the temperatures are higher. And that is something we observe. We see that winter temperatures are getting higher, and autumn is staying warmer than it for a longer period. Now, usually you would have by the end of October, the leaves would drop, the first cold periods would come in. And now we see that this is more frequently occurring much later. So it's the real higher temperatures, quite funnily, are concentrated in autumn and in the winter. Because even if we look at 2017, which was very hot in the spring and in the summer, if we look at end of August and September temperatures, they were not remarkably high. Actually, during harvest, we had fairly normal conditions for Bolgheri. So that makes it easy to spot out one single element in saying, let's plant Cabernet Franc everywhere and get rid of the Merlot, because it doesn't work every year. We've had some splendid Cabernet Franc vintages, and we've had others like 14 or 2010 where we were far less enthusiastic because they were late ripening, cool vintages. Cabernet Franc being a little bit of a diva, needs exceptional temperatures. So we're working on different fields. We're definitely taking a look at slightly later ripening grape varieties. And if we have a choice to replant a vineyard today, unless it's a proven great site for Merlot, we'd rather replace it with Cabernet Franc or Cabernet Sauvignon. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, we're also experimenting with even slightly later ripening grape varieties, just to make sure that we have options. We've worked on training systems. We integrated, in particular in Masseto, we integrated some bush vine training, just because it is known that is the typical training system that is adapted to very warm and dry conditions. We've worked a lot on the soil management, and quite astonishingly, we're developing more and more green covers just to sort of work really on keeping the soils as healthy and as buffering as possible, because we know that if you have soils that are in good shape, that are well structured, that are well nourished by the decaying vegetation of a cover crop, then they will react in a very different way to drier years than, let's say, in a context where the organic content of the soil is low. And so there are all these different aspects. We've been working in the last 10 years a lot also on canopy sizes in order to try to figure out if that wasn't a way to slightly slow down the ripening. So there are a lot of different elements. And quite frankly, we don't have any specific answer to say, in 20 years' time, that's what's going to be the solution. But we have 3 or 4 different areas we're working on, and hopefully in 25 years' time, we'll know which path is the right one to follow.
To follow up on another question we got, you've had quite a few new projects. I mean, just a few years ago, we were introduced to the Ornellaia Bianco. And then, of course, we have the Massettino, which was last year's new wine. And there was a question of whether or not you have any new projects on the horizon, any new ideas, or anything else that we need to know about the future.
No, I think we need a bit of a rest, because there have been indeed quite. I mean, speaking about the white wines, there's Ornellaia Bianco, which we decided to produce for the first time with the vintage 2013. But before that, we revived a wine that existed in the 1980s and 1990s, which is Poggio alle Gazze, because at a certain stage we had produced white wines, but in a formula we weren't quite feeling happy about, saying, it was more, I think, recognized because it was Sauvignon than as a wine that comes from the specific area. So when we restarted working on the white wine, we really wanted to say, we don't just want a white wine in the addition because, you want in your range, you want a white wine in addition to the red wines. But we also wanted to, discover a potential new facet about Bolgheri. It's true that the area is so recent that nobody can claim that he knows everything about Bolgheri. White wines had always been produced, but the ambition was probably not the highest, because people probably was a typically Tuscan mindset, which exists in a lot of regions where red wines are dominant. I mean, if you think about serious wine, then it has to be red by definition, and the white wine is just a sort of necessary addition to the summer months, you know, because you don't want to enjoy your full-bodied reds right in August and July, and so you're physiologically in need of a white wine. I think today there's a waking up, and we're not the only ones, I think, who got ambitious about their white wines. I see a lot of colleagues in Bordeaux doing exciting things and exciting stuff around the white wines, because there's a sort of change in the mindset and a little bit all over Tuscany, and I think all over Italy, to say we're not, because we're southern, we're not only meant to produce great red wines. There's probably, if we spot out the right spots, there's also high potential for the white wines. How far are we going to get with that? It's work in progress, but I would also hate to expand too much and diversify too much in any sort of new projects, because, you know, the wines is something that we feel very strongly about, and we want to make sure that we make them right. So we want to make sure we have enough focus time to make the best possible wines we can. Best possible white wines, and of course reds, but, you know, the white are certainly keeping us busy, and there's a lot of work in progress, but, you know, again, one of the miracles of the 2017 vintage is that we turned out to be quite happy with the whites, although when we harvested, and those were harvested really very early, we were not quite sure whether we would be able to make anything interesting at all. The fact is that we bottled both wines, both Poggio Legazzi and Ornellaia Bianco, and again, they are certainly a little bit more opulent, a little bit riper, but I think we're able to make some interesting white wines, even if the vintage, you know, on paper seemed not particularly favorable.
I want to give a shout out to, I must be Riccardo Binda. I see you from the Bolgheri Consortium saying hello. Ciao, Riccardo. Anyway, no, we also had a question. What is your favorite vintage of Ornellaia?
You know, that's always, I'm sure you know that no winemaker wants to answer this question. And there are probably moments, I mean, I like to pick wines that I haven't made personally for two reasons. First of all, because, you know, picking the favorite amongst the ones you've been responsible for is always a kind of difficult exercise. And secondly, because I like also the idea to pick a vintage that really shows what Ornellaia is looking like when it's mature. And for a very long time, and probably including me when I arrived, we didn't quite know, because the wines were just too young. I mean, there have been some great vintages already in the 1980s. I can think of 88 and 90. But even then, when I arrived in 2005, there were hardly wines that I would have considered fully mature. And then there were the vintages of the late 1990s and 2000s, which were, to me, definitely the sort of benchmarks I would compare everything I was going to try to do at Ornellaia to, but there were young wines as well. Today we have some of those vintages that are really coming to full maturity, so I'd have to pick two, because one would be too difficult for me. To me, the favorite would be today 2001 and 98. Two quite different vintages, one more refined and chiseled, the other a little bit more robust, a little bit more maybe less formally perfect, but full of character, and that would be 98. The formally perfect would be 2001, because these are two great vintages of Ornellaia which are really hitting their peak now. And it's been great. The fact has been great that I had enough time to follow these wines in 15 years of working at Ornellaia. So I've seen them as very young wines. I've seen them go through the different phases, and now I can see them really getting close to their full peak. So yeah, those are, And most recently, there's always this moment when when a wine really crosses a big step and is from a virtually ready wine, gets to fully ready. And particularly for the 2001, that has just happened in the last 2 or 3 years. So now it's there. Now there's going to be the next interesting thing is going to see and follow for how long they'll stay on that peak.
Just on that plateau.
Yeah.
I can't help but follow up with the same question for Masseto. Or 2 vintages that are that you hold dear to your heart for Masseto.
That would cite one because it really corresponds to a sort of first great encounter. Because when I joined Ornellaia in 2005, I had tasted Ornellaia on several occasions. I had heard a lot about Masseto, but I'd never tasted it. And to be quite honest, I didn't quite know what to think of this wine. Was it just some sort of fancy, limited cuvée, a limited selection, something? So I didn't quite know. And we happened to be at a dinner with some of our clients, and we opened magnums of 97 Masseto. And that was the first time I tasted it. I remember that I was really blown away because I wouldn't have imagined what a genuinely individual and unique wine it was. So it really struck me as this is not just a made-up wine and very fancy and that was a little bit still, towards the 2000s, a little bit what everybody was wondering about when it came to the category that we don't like as a name, the one of Super Tuscans, because we could still see a lot of people thinking, are these wines all made up, or is there really something true and genuine behind them? And in the case of Masseto, I got my remarkable answer having my first sip of 97, which just blew me away as a wine. So that continues. There have been a lot of fantastic and fabulous Massetos ever since, and some possibly even greater than that 97, although this is an iconic vintage. But as it's really been the first time, this was the first time that I will, I think, remember for the rest of my life.
You brought up the Super Tuscans, and this is something that I've been, I've given a lot of thought to this, and I wish that we could come up with a different way of categorizing these wines. And of course, the only solution would be to have them have the strong territorial identity that they have. And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts? Do you have any solution for how we can articulate a thought for a category that replaces this now overused and no longer meaningful category of Super Tuscans? It's a big question, but I'm asking out of.
It's almost in a certain way it's a historical term, because for the lack of a better word, when these wines came up in the 1980s, something had to be found, because it was probably a bit confusing. They all came out as vini da tavola, which is the lowest category, but just because they didn't correspond to any existing DOC rules. And then there were people still today tend to consider that Super Tuscans are wine that are made out of international grape varieties, which is another term that I personally dislike a lot. And then it's forgetting that some of the very earliest wines were pure Sangiovese, which was something unheard of in Tuscany at the time. I think the only solution, and it's going to take some time, is to really always mention the place where they come from. Because if we look at those Super Tuscans who have survived, they survived, I believe, because they were able to transmit the particularity of their site. We had a group, and we're not meeting on a regular basis again. We haven't met for quite a long time. We should probably do this. Of almost a group of the main, great Merlots coming out of Tuscany. So we did various tastings together with Stefano Frascolla, with Luca San Giusto, and with Le Macchiole. And I think that is a good, if you're able to do that, if you taste all these different expressions of Merlot coming from a grape variety which is supposedly producing the most, innocuous and banal and streamlined wines. Each one of these wines has something very unique and very particular to express, and they're not interchangeable. You know, Galatrona coming from the Variano Varezzo, it's much leaner, much tighter, very aromatic. Redigaffi is an even more luscious and opulent wine that speaks of this warmer side of Suvereto. Even Messorio and Masseto, which, you know, are almost neighbors. Make two completely different wines. So I think that is at the heart, as much as possible mentioning. Now, we in Bulgaria, we have, it's been for a long time difficult for us because we had to cope with two categories we were put in, which we don't like. The one is Super Tuscan and the other is international grape varieties or a Bordeaux blend from Tuscany. Luckily, we are able to get our own DOC. Which allows for some flexibility, but which has acknowledged that in this place, what is commonly considered as being the best expressions are Bordeaux grape varieties.
What was your idea with the Merlot, with putting together the producers of the great Merlots? Was that an idea to create
no, that was something that happened for a few years on a very informal basis, but then, you know, we're all busier today, we're all in a rush, so we unfortunately, all of us, we don't take enough time to gather together but that was, you know, because of personal friendships, and then we met very informally whenever there was a possibility to taste our wines together.
We had two questions, and they're almost related. One was to talk a little bit more about the Bulgari territory, and there was another question about Sangiovese and how you use Sangiovese in the blends, and what, you know, what role does Sangiovese play? And it's interesting because Sangiovese is a grape that's not particularly well suited to Bulgari, or at least it hasn't been historically. So it's, I mean, maybe you could even tie the two concepts together.
Well, it's true that well, it's difficult because I must make sure that Michele Santa is not listening.
Of course.
Because there are people, and quite rightly, I mean, everybody has, some people would, and including him, would probably disagree with the fact that Sangiovese doesn't work in Bulgaria, you know. I think at a time when winemaking was a little bit less precise, it is clear that in a site that was not necessarily particularly well suited for Sangiovese, wines would have been poor. Today, it's probably a little bit different, and I wouldn't say categorically that Sangiovese doesn't work. The question is, and for us at Ornellaia, we answered the question for us. Is it greater than what Cabernet Franc, Merlot, or Cabernet Sauvignon can do in Bulgaria? To us, but then that's Ornellaia. The answer would be no. Is then Sangiovese from Bulgaria as great an expression of this great varieties than the best wines coming from Chianti and Montalcino? I keep this question open in order not to be, in order to be able to drive home safely. So that, I think, is the genuine question. It shouldn't be. It is possible to add Sangiovese. I think today for Ornellaia, our history is pretty much settled. So I don't know if we want to turn everything upside down. There are a few little additions we've done in the past, and our path was to go more into the direction of Bordeaux grape varieties. We would have had the possibility to plant or Sangiovese or maybe even Syrah, which a couple of our colleagues did, but we said, you know, let's keep it into that direction because we find it's consistent with the history of Ornellaia. It's what we believe works best in Bulgaria. But I'm sure it is possible, and I know it's possible, as some colleagues are doing that, to add a little bit of Sangiovese, because I think it, even if it does not necessarily need to be, or it's not necessarily reasonable to have it on its own, it adds something specifically Tuscan. And I think one of the virtues in a certain way of Sangiovese is that it takes remarkably little of it in a blend to alter the character of a wine. Do we want to do that for Ornellaia? Do we want to do that for Licerion?